Peoples in Asia had varying kinds of experience with white domination. India and most of the countries of Southeast Asia became colonies of Europe. China was semi-colonized, and Japan never colonized at all. The Chinese met the arriving Western white man with an attitude of disdainful superiority, and the Japanese met him with contemptuous hostility. They both went through the experience of subjection or subordination to white power or white superiority as a galling ordeal. In India, much more fragmented and with much less coherent sense of any common history or identity among as many peoples, the response was much weaker and more ambivalent. In every case, however, where responses to Westerners took place in racial terms, they were superimposed upon strongly rooted attitudes about race and skin color that long antedated this encounter. These included powerful race chauvinism, like those of the Chinese and Japanese, social and caste differences accompanied by color differences, as in India, and almost universally, notions of beauty linked to whiteness or lightness of skin. I am T.B. Wahid, Black Living Room Talk. I am reading Group Identity and Political Change by Harold R. Isaacs. I'm just going to say it's the next section. The Chinese were beaten into submission by Westerners in the 19th century. As a result, many Chinese did to some degree accept the white man's view of white superiority, especially in the matter of military power. Only a few Chinese accepted the Western religion that this power supported. But toward the end of the century, many modernizing intellectuals did embrace Western social and political ideas in a belated effort to catch up with Western advances. But even while they submitted and sought to emulate, most Chinese retained their great self-pride, rooted in their sense of race and culture, in their identification with a long and great past. Almost alone, indeed, this sustained them during the century and a half of their humiliating subordination to Western barbarians. It burst forth again with explosive vigor when the time finally arrived for Chinese self-reassertion and the revolutionary upheavals of the last few decades. The Japanese, for their part, reacting more convulsively to the first Western blows a century ago, moved much more quickly than the Chinese to acquire a countervailing power of their own. Their first great success against the West, their defeat of Russia in 1905, was not only a major event in the history of the struggle for power in Asia, but also a great turning point in the hitherto one-sided contest between white and non-white, and it was clearly and explicitly seen as such throughout the white-dominated world. Before the Japanese were through, they nearly succeeded in conquering China and replacing the West empires in Asia with their own. In the course of this effort, they used the racial theme to the full, both in appealing to their fellow Asiatics and in depicting Westerners, especially Americans, as white racists under whom no one in Asia could live a self-respecting life. So they depicted Westerners, especially Americans, as white racists under whom no one in Asia could live a self-respecting life. The Japanese offered instead what they proved quite unable to deliver, a self-respecting life under the aegis of Japan. They failed at this, in part at least, because they could not help trying to become the master race of Asia themselves. This Japanese drive was defeated, and the Japanese thrust for self-assertion had to begin all over again and to seek new forms. The Japanese bring to this process a view of themselves and of others that is rooted no less deeply than that of the Chinese in physical as well as historical and cultural self-images. When Japan fell, it became China's turn at least to seek once more, through its new and aggressive communist regime, to erase all the humiliations the Chinese had suffered at the hands of the West for so long. Behind the high and wild emotional drive of this Chinese self-assertion, it is necessary to see the whole history of Western white behavior in China during the last 150 years. But in looking for its sources, one also has to look beyond this history into the deep pools of Chinese culture and racial chauvinism. I am listening to my Japanese lo-fi playlist, no copyright music. The strong belief in the superiority of the race of Han and the view of all non-Chinese as barbarians are well-known features of the standard Chinese self-image. They go back to the remotest antiquity. I have heard of making Chinese out of barbarians, said the great sage Minkus nearly 2,500 years ago. But I have never heard of making barbarians out of Chinese. From those most ancient times, Chinese terms for non-Chinese of almost any kind were characteristically derogatory. They almost always either referred to some physical characteristic or attributed to non-Chinese some beast-like character or non-human origin. Virtually all non-Chinese were kuitis, ghosts or devils. You can look up this word. I will give you the spelling. Kuei-Tze. It means ghosts or devils. Inhabitants of the netherworld beyond and below China, where civilized human beings dwelled. Peoples around the fringes of ancient China were usually described by words representing animals. Foxes, wildcats, wolves, apes, and varieties of insects. Xingnu, the name for the Huns, beyond northern China's borders, means literally something to do with slaves, but a history of the Wei period also tells us that the Xingnu were the result of the union of a barbarian chieftain's daughter and an old wolf. That is why the history of Wei goes on to explain. These people like to stretch their necks and utter long cries, like wolves howling. The Turks are similarly recorded as the outcome of a union between a female wolf and a young boy. Hsiung-Nu, the name for the Huns. Hsiung-Nu. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I'm gonna look it up myself for the correct pronunciation. Skin color rarely appears among these descriptions, but does figure sharply in passages about the Kunlun slaves, brought to China by the wide-ranging Chinese traders from islands in the southern seas during the Tang and Sung dynasties, usually called devil slaves or black devils. They were apparently seen more as beasts than as humans. In the 19th century, the black devils reappear in the shape of Indian troops brought in by the invading British. Chinese writers of the time described the English as the green-eyed devils, like the fiercest and most evil of the dragons of the spirit world, and their slave soldiers as black devils. The white ones were cold and dull as the dead ashes of frogs, wrote a poet. The black ones were ugly and dirty as coal. How and when the Chinese were introduced to the European idea that they were members of the yellow race, and how they received the news, are all matters still apparently waiting a closer look at the relevant literature of the past century or so. Much waits to be found, as a letter written by a Chinese scholar in the closing years of the Manchu dynasty indicates. Of the 5 colors, yellow is the color of the soil, and the soil is the core of the universe. Westerners identify Chinese as a yellow race. This implies that from the beginning, when heaven and earth were created, the Chinese were given the central place. When Westerners laugh at Chinese egotism, why can we not explain it by this reasoning? In the Chinese classical tradition, as in the Japanese, that so largely stemmed from it, the celebration of whiteness as a criterion of feminine beauty is a familiar theme. A poet of the 4th century BC celebrated a bevy of beauties for their black painted eyebrows and white powdered cheeks. Of Yang Kuefei, the most celebrated beauty in Chinese history, the Tang poet Po Chu Yi wrote, "So white her skin, so sweet her face, none could with her compare. Hands and arms of dazzling white move gracefully through endless reams of ancient Chinese poetry." The most common metaphor for feminine skin was white jade, and references to all the visible surfaces of jade-colored female skin abound in poet songs. Chinese folk songs are similarly filled with the whiteness of generations of beloveds. "My sweetheart is like a flower," sings one. "Please do not let the sun burn her back." In story after story, Chinese writers of the 1940s were still quivering at the snow-white or pure white necks and arms of their heroines. There is some evidence that these standards have prevailed not only among effete upper-class Chinese, but among rude villagers as well. Although Chinese racial and cultural chauvinism is a well-known fact, its particulars have been little studied. It has always figured in the long and complex history of Chinese relations with non-Chinese peoples within China itself, continuing into the present communist era. Chinese overseas have intermarried freely with many other kinds of people, but not without creating certain strains or areas of separateness between mixed Chinese and the unmixed, a condition not difficult to discover in places like Hawaii and the Philippines. Some suggestion of the Chinese style in these matters turns up in their vocabulary in conflict situations. In the conflict between Chinese and Malays in Malaysia, for example, the racial issue and any expression of it bearing on skin color in particular is quite marginal compared to the cultural, historical, economic, and political issues that lie between the two groups. But even so, the powerful and highly chauvinistic Chinese cultural self-image reinforces itself by views of others expressed as expressed, as Chinese feelings so often are in physical terms. While the most common local Chinese term for Malays is probably Melakwai or Malay devils, another common one is Blachan, literally a prawn paste, a way of referring to the Malays as brown with the additional suggestion of dark and unattractive. The Chinese term for Indians in Malaysia is Tausi Kwa, Tausi meaning a kind of black bean, the literal rendering thus becoming black bean devils. This is like a Shanghai term for Indians, Haitan, which means simply black coal. The common Malay vernacular retorts to the Chinese in kind, its word for the Chinese being mata sapek, which means slit eyes. Chinese racial attitudes have come into public or semi-public view only rarely, as they did in 1945 when Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing tried to keep Negro American troops from entering China over the Burma Road, which they had just done more than anybody else to reopen. Much more recently, an African student in Peking has described communist Chinese mentors as filled with the idea of the superiority of yellow over black. On the larger scene of the Sino-Soviet conflict in recent years, the Chinese communists have made strenuous efforts to win friends among Asians, Africans, and Latin Americans by stressing the solidarity of non-whites against whites. Wow, so I've learned something new myself today on that part, that the Sino-Soviet conflict, which are Chinese communists, tried to win friends and try to stress that non-whites need to come together. In public print, this has always been done by euphemism, the Chinese stressing the European character of the Russians in order to keep them out of all Asian or Afro-Asian enterprises. In their corridor politicking, they have been described as using the racial theme bluntly and crudely in their attempt to win friends for themselves and to alienate others from their Russian foes. There has been some impression, but little information about the extent to which their own racial behavior has helped to defeat these Chinese efforts, especially among Africans. Chinese communist propaganda in general now bestows on Americans all the beast-like features traditionally attributed to all barbarians. They are the offspring of wolves, like the Xingnu of long ago, and like the early arriving Portuguese explorers of 4 centuries ago. They are depicted as devourers of children. In India, skin color attitudes are almost pervasively present in the contemporary culture. They can be traced all the way back to Indian prehistory, to the relationships said to have been established between light-skinned conquerors, the Aryas, and the dark-skinned inhabitants of the country, the Dasyas. These attitudes, identified with the shaping of the Hindu society over the millennia, persist today in the entwining of color with caste. The Sanskrit word for the large caste group, varna, means color, and the word caste, from the Latin by the Portuguese, means purity connected with biological lineage or something very close to and including color. In classical Hindu text, there is an association of colors with the main case groups: white with the Brahmins at the top, black with the Sudras at the bottom, red or bronze and yellow with the middle groups of Kshatriya and Vaishya. Although there is much denial that these assignments of color values bear directly on skin color as such, there is enough in the past and present actually of Hindu society to make it plain that skin color is related in important ways to hierarchies of status in the Hindu system. Although mountains of literature have been produced about Hindu caste, this aspect of it has not been overstudied. Some modern Indian writers argue heavily against the presence of color implications in the caste system without being able to make the fact of color caste in Indian society go away. Highly explicit color values are found in the elaborate criteria that figure in beauty standards and marriage preferences. As anyone can discover any week in any Indian newspapers, matrimonial advertisements, and other choices, relations, and attitudes along the spectrum that shades from the light-skinned northerners to the still dark-skinned southerners. These values, vivid in Indian life, have of course been reflected in some of the new relationships created by recent political change. Indian attitudes about color have obviously had much to do with relations between Indian and Africans in Africa. These might be seen again as a product of European-created circumstances in which Indians, particularly in Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa, occupied the position of middlemen traders sandwiched between the ruling whites and the ruled blacks. They naturally identified themselves as far as they could with the dominant whites, keeping as detached as possible from the lowly blacks. Gandhi began his life struggle in South Africa, but it was a struggle to win rights for the Indians there, not for the blacks. So there you have it about Gandhi's beginnings. He started his life struggle there in South Africa, but it was a struggle to win rights for the Indians there, not for the blacks. In the past decade, Indian-African antagonisms rooted in their economic relations have more than once erupted into violence, mostly in the form of African attacks on Indians. Indians, for their part, have been attempting in these recent years to find common political ground and greater acceptance among Africans, not only among those who have now gained power, as in East Africa, but among those who are still far from doing so, as in South Africa. These efforts have had very limited success. The new nationalist India, intent on winning and influencing African friends, has extended facilities including scholarships to African students for study in India. Didn't know that. In India, unhappily, many of them have encountered the Indian color system in which the dark-skinned person is held in the least esteem and the black person in no esteem at all. This, too, has erupted embarrassingly into print. As far back as 1955, a group of African students in New Delhi publicly complained that they had found the prejudice of Indians almost as bad as that of South African Europeans. These complaints touched off a flurry of mortified and deeply felt disclaimers and explanations from their Indian host. India's 65 million untouchables or legally ex-untouchables, have their own share of these common patterns of Indian color differences and attitudes. Through their experience of recent change, India's color patterns are irregularly sliced. Untouchables are commonly thought to be darker than most other Indians. This is reflected in some of the terms used by caste Hindus to describe untouchables. The most mortifying ones employed in Kerala, for example, being Karumpan, black fellow, or Karumpi, black girl, although more untouchables may be darker than lighter in color. There are also black or near black Brahmin or other caste Hindu southerners and lighter brown untouchable northerners. A popular folk rhyme dealing with personality attributes of different groups of people includes the following lines: beware of a black colored Brahmin and the white colored Shamar, untouchable leatherworker. They can only be handled with shoe in hand, meaning that they only understand a forceful or threatening attitude. The implication, according to one explanation, is that the transposed skin colors in these cases came about only through bastard birth, and that bastards are always crooked and need punishment. The extent to which the line of pollution and untouchability in India is a color line is like almost everything else in the Hindu setting, unclear and ambiguous. These examples could be multiplied almost indefinitely. About each one, much waits to be learned of what is past. Much needs to be more closely scrutinized in the present. At the very least, they suggest that the issues of race and color among men have not been reduced as a source of conflict, only shifted to new places on the crowded stage of current affairs. Every individual, wherever he may be located in this chaotic landscape, has to shape or reshape his sense of the content and meaning of his identification with his primary group, the group in which he finds himself by virtue of where, when, and to whom he is born. In this set of his identifications, his race or the color of his skin will continue to have special meaning to him and to all to whom he relates. Neither homogenization nor the brotherhood of men being in near view, the minimum conclusion is that racial and color differences will continue to figure more often abrasively than not in the reshaping of political and social patterns and relationships that will go on during the remaining years of this century and beyond into the next. Well, and that was the end of Group Identity and Political Change by Harold R. Isaacs. And it said that even with homogenization, neither homogenization nor the brotherhood of men being in near view, the minimum conclusion is that racial and color differences will continue to figure more often abrasively than not in the reshaping of political and social patterns and relationships that will go on during the remaining years of this century and beyond into the next. I read that part at the end just now and my mind just went to thinking. Like it's just like the never ending story, just never ending, just ongoing. It's just That's really something to think about. And I recently found out, as I know probably some of you all have found out too, that in India there's black people. Black people in China. Black people in Japan. These are things that are just not shown. But now, with the internet, social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all these things coming out, things that weren't shown to us, truths that were not spoken of. Black people, a global people. There's nowhere that the black man hasn't touched. I mean, you can see his presence. The late Dr. Francis Cress Welsing said, and I quote, "Whenever you see a black man being arrested by gunpoint, beaten, killed on the side of the road by the law," she said, "just know that it is about your genetic annihilation and their genetic survival." I'll leave you with that. Please do your research yourself. The next reading will be the role of color in adaptation phenomena by Francois Ravieux. I wish you peace, love, and light. Please stay tuned to Black Living Room Talk with me, Empress Wahid.